So welcome everyone, to those of you who are here and the folks online. I don't know where to look to find you, but I want to welcome you to the Center for Children and Families last lecture of our spring lecture series. It is our 15th year, which is very exciting. I want to introduce you to our speaker this morning. Dr. Diane Mitschke comes to us from the University of Texas at Arlington's School of Social Work, where she's the school's Associate Dean of Academic and Student Affairs and Associate Professor. I'm very pleased and excited to have her here to present this last talk of our series. I know that Dr. Mitschke's research will be of great interest to us and, to all of you, as it relates to the translational research and community outreach programs of the Center for Children and Families, serving to advance the healthy development of children and their families. Dr. Mitschke's research focuses on the unique physical and mental health needs of recently resettled refugees in the U.S. She'll be sharing how her approach to her research strives to ensure that her work has a direct and meaningful impact on the communities she serves, that refugee voices are acknowledged and appreciated. A little background. Dr. Mitschke earned her bachelor's in social work from the University of Texas at Austin, her MSW from the University of Michigan, go blue, and her doctorate in social welfare from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She's received over $1.4 million in funding to conduct her research on refugee youth and their families. In her role as Associate Dean in UT Arlington School of Social Work, she oversees its graduate and undergraduate programs, which educates over 2,200 students, one of the largest social work programs in the United States. Now, just one more thing. Diane's living arrangement. When Dr. Mitschke isn't conducting research in the community or directing this massive body of students at UT Arlington, she's on her small farm south of Dallas, actually south of Arlington. I mean, a long way from here. So yes, that's right, a farm with animals, organic garden, her husband, Aaron, and her children. And I'm very appreciative that she made the very long trek to far, far north Richardson to visit with us here at UT Arlington. So please acknowledge her presence here and welcome her to give us her talk this morning. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. Dr. Owen and I have another relationship. We sing in a choir together, and I was so excited at one of our choir socials. Dr. Owen mentioned this opportunity, and I was just thrilled that we could make this work. And so it's just an honor to be here and a privilege to be in this beautiful space on this beautiful morning. So again, thank you so much. As Dr. Owen said, my plan this morning is to talk a little bit about refugee resettlement. My work has been here in the Metroplex for the past 16 years. And most of the work that I do is centered in Dallas, primarily in the Vickery Meadow neighborhood, as well as in East Dallas, where I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we do through a clinic for refugees specifically. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Maybe. There we go. So the premise of my talk today is really a thread related to a roller coaster, because I think for many children, regardless of their refugee status or not, Childhood and adolescence often feels like a roller coaster. I know for me as a parent, it feels like a roller coaster when I'm trying to parent my children through this time period as we transition from childhood into early adolescence and eventually young adulthood. And so throughout the presentation today, I'm going to kind of talk about some of those hills and valleys that are a part of that journey for children, and in particular, refugee children who have resettled here in the United States. So my plan today is to talk first about what it means to be an ethnographic researcher and the work that I've done to embed myself in the refugee community here in Dallas. I'll talk just a little bit about what refugee resettlement looks like here in the United States. I know many of you are already familiar with what resettlement is and that process, so I won't belabor the details, but to make sure we're all on the same page, I want to make sure that everyone kind of knows what that experience is like. I'm going to talk specifically about a particular group of refugees, the Karen, who are an ethnic group from Burma. The reason for that is it's important, I think, to remember that we have refugees coming to Dallas every day from all over the world. And the one thing in common is that they are fleeing persecution in their homeland, but that's about it in terms of what they have in common. Their experiences are qualitatively different. Indeed, refugees from Burma, here in the United States, there are over 100 different ethnic groups represented just from the country of Burma alone. Here in Dallas, we have about 6 major ethnic groups from Burma that have been resettled. So we're talking today about one, although most of the information that I share today is relevant for the refugee experience in general. I'll talk again about kind of those hills and valleys and then really finish up with how we promote resilience as practitioners, as educators, as parents, as community members. What can we do to make this resettlement experience a good one for children and families, and give some context around the research and practice related to that. So, life as an ethnographic researcher, as Dr. Owen mentioned, and I'm sorry for those of you that are not here present in the room with us, you can't see, but my husband, Aaron, is in the back of the room, and he's also in this picture. This is actually a picture that was taken in our kitchen at our house. And our daughter and son are in this picture, but really what I'm trying to show you here and through many of the pictures that I'll share today is that I really strongly believe that when we do this kind of research, it really is unethical to do research without being familiar and embedded and trusted by the community. And so much of my work over the past 16 years has been to learn and grow and become a part of this community so that in asking the questions that I ask, I'm doing it as a colleague and a friend and in a reciprocal kind of way. And so sometimes the lines between research and practice are a little bit blurry for me as an ethnographer. So this picture here is my daughter not looking real thrilled with the situation, and 2 amazing refugee women who are actually here at our farm picking tomatoes. And then in this chaotic picture on the other side is our living room looking quite chaotic indeed. And we are playing a word bingo game with a group of refugees to try and work on the language barrier that is a really common and important barrier for most refugees that come here to the United States and try to get settled. So as I mentioned, I'm going to focus today on the Karen, which is an ethnic group that came from Burma. They're the largest ethnic group of refugees from Burma that have resettled here in the United States. To date, about 200,000, a little bit more, have been resettled all across the US. In some areas more than others, Dallas is a huge resettlement city, particularly for the Karen. Minneapolis and Buffalo are other cities where we see lots of Karen. So it's really interesting. Different cities in the United States have large populations of different refugee populations. About 77,000 adolescent and young adult refugees from Burma live here now, and more than 25,000 refugees from Burma have resettled to Texas. So quickly, I promise, I won't belabor this. The refugee resettlement process, I think it's important to understand kind of what this looks like so that we have an understanding of the different stages that refugee children and adolescents are coping with throughout their journey. The first phase is pre-migration. Then there's this middle phase of migration, which is the actual process of trying to get from one place to another. And then you have resettlement finally, which resettlement can last many, many years. So pre-migration, this is actually a child soldier that is pretty commonplace when we look at the Karen population in particular. We see children who are really taking on this role and being exposed to pretty significant violence when they're still in Burma. Many of these children lose one or both parents or other family members, so they're dealing with grief and loss. And they're often running or escaping from villages that have been pillaged. They're hiding. So deprivation is certainly a characteristic that really follows them during this pre-migration phase. For Karen in Burma, this pre-migration phase happens exclusively in Burma. Once they then are able to get to relative safety, we move into the migration phase. I'm sorry, I want to make sure I share this quote with you. Throughout the presentation, I have embedded quotes from qualitative research that I've done with adolescents and young adults. This study in particular that this quote is coming from was a study looking at young adults who had resettled here and were reflecting back on some of the traumatic experiences that they had at each of these stages of the migration process. So this one says, I remember I was a free child and we used to play in the mud and they had a big river and we would have to go there. It wasn't dirty, it was clear. We would swim and look for fish. Happy memories. So the reason I included this quote is that I think it's really important to acknowledge for some of these teenagers and young adults, it's not all trauma. It's not all traumatic memories. And so some of them, particularly when they were young children in Burma, have these positive associations with Burma. So some of them are really struggling with the conflict between trying to wrap their heads around Burma as a dangerous and terrible place, but also this is my homeland and I have strong positive memories of this place. So that struggle is, I think, important to think about as we make sure that we don't just characterize the entire experience as traumatic, that there are pieces of resilience that we'll see that are threaded through this. The migration phase for the Karen in particular looks like life in a refugee camp. So once they're able to cross the border into Thailand, they are admitted to one of several refugee camps. The resettled refugees that live here in Dallas that are Karen, many of them spent upwards of 10 to 15 years living in these camps, waiting essentially for their number to be called. So that they could then move to the next spot, to the next country. You can imagine what life in a refugee camp is like. Sometimes it's scary. There are often limited resources, limited food allotments per family. There are soldiers that guard the camps so that there are no free entry and exit points. And there are limited opportunities for education and language learning within the camp itself. When I lived in camp, sometimes I want to go somewhere, like want to go to a different place. Sometimes I want to go back to my country. I can't go back. You have to stay in the camp. So this sense of really feeling imprisoned and trapped in this holding place, waiting for that next stage, which again could be 1 year, could be 15 years. Many children are born in the camp and never experienced life in Burma. So that's really all they knew before they came to the United States. The resettlement period is the period that I really want to focus on today, because I haven't been to the camps myself. I haven't been to Burma. I haven't been able to conduct research there. What I have really focused on is, once that resettlement happens for these refugees, what do we do here in our society as Americans to support them, to support their adjustment culturally and educationally, to make sure that they have the best start that they can here in the United States. There are lots of things on that roller coaster that children and adolescents experience. Things like language barriers. Obviously, right? That's a big one, but most of the children that come over here that have lived in camp don't know English. Their parents don't know English. They arrive and they're immediately placed into a school where English is the language that's spoken. And so really trying to find their way, it presents a number of challenges early on in the resettlement process. There are lots of different kinds of new cultural norms, things that they used to do in camp, things that are new and different here and sometimes uncomfortable. Many of the refugees that we work with have experienced discrimination and prejudice. We experience a lot of threats toward newcomers in our country, and in Texas in particular. And so there's a lot of resistance to brand new newcomers to the United States who don't speak English. And refugees are often faced with these kinds of challenges in their initial resettlement period. Often they're resettled in areas that are low cost and hence have a very high crime rate. So having escaped violence in their home country, having escaped violence in the refugee camps, they then are resettled here in America and are often victims of crime. Muggings, robberies, violence are commonplace in many of the resettled communities where we experience refugee resettlement. And then there's a lot of role confusion, which I'll talk a little bit later. And what I mean by that is, for children in particular, when they're placed into the school system here, they are quick learners often. They're very resilient and they learn English pretty quickly, certainly compared to their parents, who are less adept at learning language quickly and are often focused on a sole goal of becoming economically self-sufficient. That's the way our system is set up, and so they are immediately placed into training programs for employment and then jobs, and that is considered kind of the main goal at the very beginning of their resettlement. They don't often have time to participate in language learning classes, even though these are often offered. So children and adolescents very early on experience this role confusion or a role reversal, where they are the ones that are really adept at navigating all of the different systems that their parents are encountering. And we'll talk a little bit about that later and how that relates to filial responsibility. Just to give you a little bit of context, this is a graph showing refugee resettlement from 2010 to 2020. So over this period of 10 years, Texas actually was the #1 state to receive refugees. And 10% of all refugees actually were resettled in Texas. We flip back and forth year to year between us and California, but we do have a whole lot of refugees here in Texas. And you can see, as I was talking about the Karen and how many Karen in particular and refugees from Burma are resettled. You can see we're orange here in Texas, and orange represents in this map Myanmar, which is synonymous with Burma. I should explain why I say Burma instead of Myanmar. You may be more familiar with Myanmar. I do this out of respect for the resettled refugees that we work with. They see Myanmar as a name of their home country that was changed by the ruling party, by the party that, you know, pillaged their villages and victimized them. So they don't own the name Myanmar. Instead, they refer to it as Burma, and so I do out of respect for them. So resettlement. This is a picture of a family around the holiday time in their apartment in Vickery Meadow. Most apartments look a lot like this. So sparse furniture and a whole lot of people. That's what you would see if you walked around Vickery Meadow in any of the apartment complexes that you might find refugees. This is a typical apartment. There are a few priorities that I want to mention during that initial resettlement resettlement period. One is in this first picture represented by healthcare. So really making sure that refugee children and families get the kind of healthcare access that they need to enroll in school, in particular, immunizations, helping them navigate that process of figuring out how to actually get the clearance that they need to get into the school system. And then also just regular access to healthcare. I mentioned that the work that we do is now often in East Dallas. There's a clinic in East Dallas called Agape Clinic where my husband, Aaron is a nurse practitioner, and he and I began working with Agape Clinic in 2011. We opened a refugee clinic on the weekend specifically for refugees. And so at this clinic, after that initial 6-month period of assistance that refugees receive once they're resettled, they don't typically have access to healthcare anymore. And so this is a free clinic where they can come and receive interpretation help and translation and kind of help just navigating all of the different pieces of what it means to get access to healthcare and affordable healthcare so that they don't end up in the ER with giant hospital bills, as you can imagine. So healthcare is a primary priority, schooling a second priority, which I've talked about a little bit already, and then of course employment. We see most of the refugees coming over are immediately employed at either manufacturing plants or Tyson is a huge employer. So the food industry where they're really line workers and they typically work 6 days a week, about 10 to 12-hour days. So it's pretty intense work. It's we see over time that wears on a person, right? So healthcare then becomes all the more important. We see injuries and pain becoming more and more prominent over time when they're placed in these kinds of situations. Oh, wait, hold on. Okay. A culture of stress is a really important part of that resettlement period. And as I said before, resettlement in and of itself can last from the day they walk off the, airport runway until 14, 15, 20 years later. The refugees that we started working with when we arrived here in Dallas in 2006, we still see them. We still see them every weekend. They're still dealing with these kinds of things. So yes, some of this dissipates as you learn the language and as you familiarize yourself with some of the, culture here in the US, but other things you carry with you. And part of that is experiencing trauma that you carry with you across your life trajectory. Language continues to be a source of stress for children and for adults. Access. I have a study going on right now looking at opportunities related to transportation. So where refugees are resettled within a particular area in the city, and how that increases or decreases their access to educational opportunities, employment opportunities, healthcare, all of the kinds of things that we consider important in terms of navigating a successful life here. Nutrition is a big deal. Most of the refugees that resettle here are introduced to a completely different diet here in the United States, like many immigrants, and that is a shock. We see a lot of, over time, we see a lot of well-meaning groups wanting to do something for the refugee community, and so we see things like food drives and things like that, and it's very interesting over time because we have embedded ourselves in this community, and we often find cans of food on our doorstep that have been given to, families in this community, and they have absolutely no interest in eating anything that has ever been canned. And so it's boxes of cereal, for example. So while there are some great things that we can do here, as native Texans to welcome, these folks into our community, sometimes we need to learn a little bit more about the culture and what is actually acceptable so that the things that we do aren't actually wasted. So that's been an interesting process for us as kind of trying to help be a facilitator between, well-meaning groups and the refugees themselves. This is an example of some of the work we do when we're actually knocking on doors in some of these apartment complexes. Often these communities, these families will say they don't need anything, everything is good, a lot of social desirability that we see. And then when we're invited in and we actually take a look, you can see this is the inside of someone's refrigerator. There are a couple of cans of water, a can of juice, and some greens and some tomatoes. So actually knowing how to access nutrition and knowing how to access foods that are familiar, and knowing that often food stamps can be used at some of the grocery stores that are not in their neighborhood, but have foods that are more familiar to them. So helping them navigate that process. For the Korean in particular, helping them find the Asian grocery stores, taking them to K-Town, and actually helping them find some of those familiar fruits and vegetables that are reminiscent of their home life is really helpful. And then this picture on the other side is opening a closet door and seeing, I'm not sure if you can see, but it's a live guinea inside the closet. So that was a surprise, but yes, no, it's alive and loud. So just working during that initial phase to have some grace and some understanding about, how can we make you help you feel comfortable, and then also not, get booted from your apartment because you have a live guinea. I don't know if you're familiar with guineas, but we live on a farm and guineas are really loud. They scream a lot, not like a chicken. So anyway, I also just want to bring this up. This is a billboard that was up for years, actually, on 30, driving from Dallas to Arlington. This is in Grand Prairie, if you're familiar with Ripley's Believe It or Not. And this billboard in particular was up for at least 3 years. And this image is of a woman that is actually from another ethnic group in Burma that we do see resettled here. So can you imagine, as a new refugee, you know, trying to navigate your way through the Metroplex and then coming across a billboard that says weird? You know, I mean, and it's an image of someone that maybe your auntie, maybe your grandma, you know, who knows? But so navigating that is really tough. Here's a quote about the resettlement process. It's too different. It is different food, different living. Every single thing is different. So that roller coaster, we've talked about some of those challenges. Let's move on and talk a little bit more specifically about the research that is embedded in this area, so that we can get some context to mental health and that trauma trajectory. So health and access to care, in general, we know that half of all resettled refugees in the United States are uninsured, and they don't have access to health care following the initial 6-month period after they're resettled. So after 6 months, after they arrive, they are literally cut off from healthcare access unless they can get it through their employer, unless they can, and some children are covered, of course, through Medicaid and CHIP, but there are a huge number of refugee children and their parents that have no access to healthcare. We see that what this does is it delays treatment. And we see this in terms of refugee children and refugee parents themselves. And it has a huge impact on the family, because if a family feels like they are going to show up at a hospital and end up with a $30,000 hospital bill the next week, then they're not going to go. And they wait until often it's way too late, and their disease has progressed to the point where they're going to require extensive treatment, or sometimes they can't even be saved. And that is something that we deal with a lot in our work at the community clinic, is really helping to educate these families about access to care, and when it's important to access care, and when it's an emergency, and what other resources are available in the community so that they don't delay treatment. We know that mental health is a big deal in this community. And most of my work in this area has focused on mental health. When we talk about refugee children in particular, we know that there are 3 major factors that play into high risk or high need for mental health among these children. And this is specifically related to the resettlement period. So not pre-migration, not migration, but actually once they get here. Parental mental health disorders, obviously we know that some mental health disorders run in families. Death or separation from parents clearly is associated with mental health needs in children. But these last 3, I think, are really important because they're about the resettlement process itself. So observing their parents feeling helpless, not being able to provide for their children, not being able to navigate the system is something that contributes to poor mental health in refugee children. When parents underestimate the stress, the acculturative stress that their children are experiencing and don't acknowledge that, that can contribute to and exacerbate mental health needs in children. And then finally, watching their parents deal with unemployment and being underemployed is something that we know in terms of the parental factors that contribute to poor mental health outcomes in refugee children. There are also some child factors. The number of traumatic events that they've experienced or witnessed. So certainly we would expect, the more trauma you've witnessed or seen, the more likely you are to exhibit some mental health sequelae. Learning and language challenges. Many children, particularly those that come here as older children, so 10, 12, up to, 15, 17, we see that they have a harder time. Obviously, that makes sense, right? The younger you are, the quicker you're able to learn the language as a youth and acculturate, the easier time you're going to have. One of the hardest things is children that come over when they're 16, 17, 18, and we don't really know what to do with them, to be honest. We don't know where to put them. So sometimes we'll put them in high school, and that's really tough because they're the right age, but they don't have any language skills. And we're kind of setting them up to fail. We do have newcomer schools here in the Dallas area, but again, that age is really hard. Many of those children end up dropping out, either getting employed like their parents in a similar job, or they sometimes are eligible for what's called Job Corps, which is a job training program that often we direct kids that are 18 to 21 to, where they're getting training skills and employment skills as well as language. And that's kind of hit or miss. There are limited opportunities for that. Sometimes it works well, other times it doesn't work so great. Finally, this other factor is the environmental factor. We know that for children that have high risk for mental illness, cultural isolation, being isolated from the things that they were familiar with related to their culture, the dress, the customs, the food, all of those things can be isolating factors that pull them away from what's familiar to them and can exacerbate their mental health symptoms, poverty, the number of times they've had to transition. So I talked about the Karen in particular moving from Burma to camp to the US. Many times we see children and families that are resettled here to Dallas and then move again to another city in the United States, and some move several times. And each time a child moves, it becomes more difficult, right? To make new friends, to become familiar with the school, to trust teachers, those kinds of things. And then of course the length of time they spend in refugee camp, it has a direct association to their mental health symptoms. We see in children and adolescents higher rates of post-traumatic stress symptoms and post-traumatic stress disorder than in American children who were born here. They range from about 11% to 54%. And the reason for that range is we don't have a very good way of assessing PTSD or post-traumatic stress or depression for that matter in children or adults. As you can imagine, most of the assessment tools that we have were validated on US-born populations, on English-speaking populations, and so most of the tools that we have available to us are really just not relevant to these populations. So we see huge variation in terms of diagnosis. Depression and depressive symptoms are also higher in this population, just like they are in adult refugees. But what we see is the longitudinal effect of depression and trauma over time. So we see children who are still exhibiting higher rates of PTSD and depression even after 12, 14 years of having arrived here. So recognizing that just because a child is here and has been here for 5 years doesn't mean they've left all that trauma behind and don't carry it with them. Somatization is incredibly common in this population. We see it a lot in children and adults. So somatization is really the physical manifestation of mental health concerns. So presenting at a clinic, for example, with headaches or fatigue or pain or insomnia, all of those are actually indicative of a larger problem that is hiding often trauma or depression. And so often the work that we do is educating primary health providers about this phenomena, so that when a resettled refugee presents with something like headaches, persistent headaches, or fatigue, that yes, it's important to look at the source, so it may be effective to also treat for depression. Children with special needs. I talked a little bit about the assessment challenges that we have related to mental health. These persist, of course, when we're talking about children with different kinds of learning challenges. Really spending the time to do some different kinds of assessment that we might not normally do with a native English speaker. We might not normally do with a child who is accustomed to a more sterile office setting. So we might change the location where we provide an intervention. We know that things that don't involve a lot of talking often work well for children who struggle with language and are learning the language. So of course, play and art therapy, music therapy, and storytelling, especially for adolescents, has been seen as effective in reducing some of the symptoms of things like trauma and post-traumatic stress. School is obviously a great place to intervene for these kids because they spend, 9 hours a day at school. So if we can catch them while they're at school, that's a great way to develop some of those social support infrastructure that they need to feel supported and safe in a school environment. But recognizing that the health of a child and the wellness of a child is integrally connected to the health of their parents and the wellness of the family system. And so family-focused interventions that really look at not only the child, but also the system that surrounds that child are more effective than individual-based interventions for these populations. One study I did compared home-based counseling with office-based counseling and then a peer-led support group model. So we did a randomized trial of these 3 different kinds of interventions and found that the home-based support and the peer-led support were most effective in reducing PTSD symptoms, anxiety, and depression. So office-based counseling was a no-go for a lot of these families, and primarily that was related to the barriers that we might assume would be the case, like childcare, for younger children that weren't part of the intervention, transportation, family dynamics. As I said, they work often 6 days a week, so finding a time during office hours to come in and make that happen is challenging. Focusing on intergenerational communication, and respect is important. I talked about that role confusion issue earlier, where children are really assuming a lot of the responsibilities that we typically associate with adults. And so helping children to value their parents and their parents' contribution to the family is also something that we see as effective. Oh, sorry. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about filial responsibility, and then I'll finish by talking some about resilience. I know we're getting a little short on time, but I should be good. So filial responsibility is basically this idea that children have, in terms of a sense of obligation to serve their parents and grandparents, to give back to their parents, that they feel this innate in themselves, that is their commitment. So these are some quotes that I pulled from one of the studies I did that I thought were very telling in this area. They had a hard life. They had to run away from their land. They had to work hard so that we could have a better life. We know that they had a hard time, and it's our turn to help them. I think this is an interesting picture because you see this is actually a picture in our clinic. This is Adrian, one of our nurse practitioners. She's assessing one of our refugee clients, but what you don't see is here in the background is an adolescent who is serving as an interpreter and a cultural liaison. So this is absolutely what we see in all refugee families that we come across, is the very important and essential role that these young adults play in their parents' lives. Youth see their obligations as not only financial, but providing physical care for their parents and their grandparents. They often, once they get a license, they are the transporter in their family. So they are often called out of school to transport parents or grandparents to doctor's appointments. They often miss a lot of school because that is their role within the family. They help their parents and grandparents get access to healthcare, and as you saw, interpret and translate documents either from school. It's often the child that is coming home and translating and helping the parent to figure out how to put a signature on a piece of paper. So we see that a lot in these children that then become adolescents and caretakers for their parents. Here's another quote. It's our generation's turn to make them happy, to make them feel better, to make them not worry anymore. So this sense that their parents really sacrificed for the children, and that sense of now it's our turn and now we have this obligation, which can be really hard because I was talking actually to a refugee last weekend that came to the clinic. She's 20. She was actually enrolled at UTA in our teacher education program, and she's stopped this semester. She couldn't take classes anymore because she is responsible for her 4 younger siblings, and she's driving them to school. They go to different schools. She also is responsible for picking up and taking her parents to work in their one car. And so really helping these adolescents and young adults figure out how to navigate this pull from their family and that sense of obligation, and also helping to support them to do the things that they want to do and that they need to do to be able to have success here in the US. I thought this was a little bit funny. This is from a study on teen dating in this community, and it talks about multiple realities. So my parents threatened me, not threatened me, but said that if I ever date another race that's not Korean or like even another Southeast Asian, she's going to feed him fish paste every single day. That's how she threatened me. So if any of you have had the opportunity to smell fish paste, it is definitely an acquired smell and taste. I don't know about the taste, but the smell is certainly something that takes some getting used to. We don't want to lose our people. We don't want to change into another person where we forget our traditions, our culture, our land, and our life. We don't want to change any of these things. I want to let you hear this refugee who is helping us at our clinic as an interpreter. So let's see if I can get her to talk.
America needs good education, and everybody can learn, and everybody have the same opportunity, equal treatment. And the difficult thing is the language is called second language hard, but even like you can try and you can be successful.
All right, here's one more. Maybe.
When I grew up, I went to be a doctor and help my family at school. I'm doing good. I used to hate reading, but now I like reading. And I used to not know how to speak English, but now I do. And
so that was 2013, and here we are in 2023. Same kiddo, now with a mustache, graduating from Texas Tech in a couple of weeks. So on this roller coaster, we know that there are things that we can do to make this ride a little bit smoother for this children and the adolescents that we've talked about today. We want to recognize that resilience really is an incredible gift that these refugee children have in their possession, and being able to empower them to use that gift that they have to thrive here once they've resettled is something that I think we as a society need to learn more about and need to really commit to. This says, being Karen means that my ancestors were able to overcome foreign ruling and racial genocide. So yeah, we're a strong people. And that's really what I want to convey as we wrap up today, is that even in spite of all of these, what seem like insurmountable challenges, these youth are successful. By and large, these youth have this incredible inner strength, and they have parents that support them and have sacrificed for them. And we see success over time. So it's a long trajectory. But as we intervene, as we work with children and families to promote their health and wellness, we can contribute to that resilience and that success in this population. At the individual level, we know that children and adolescents who have a positive outlook, who have hope for the future, are more likely to overcome some of these challenges. Children who are given the chance to make choices for themselves, who have autonomy to be able to decide for themselves who they want to be and what they want to do, has a huge impact on their overall sense of self and self-efficacy. At the family level, we know that supporting families and promoting family cohesion can go a long way in helping children thrive in this environment, and helping to create school as a safe space where children feel protected and that they belong and they can develop meaningful relationships at the school and the community has an important role to play in their trajectory. Many of the refugees that we have here in the United States, particularly in Dallas, are very religious. We have a number, the Karen in particular are primarily Baptist. But we have a number of other refugee groups, many of whom are Muslim. Regardless of their faith, they typically have a very strong faith that carries them, and they believe that that is the thing that has carried them more than anything across pre-migration, migration, and resettlement. So really tapping into that as a resource is an important way to intervene. And then just to conclude, I wanted to end with this, which I think is a beautiful quote from a 26-year-old refugee woman that we've worked with for a number of years. She says, "I think we have to help our community. We have to love one another, to feel the happiness in their souls, to feel the excitement in yours. You feel happy for others. I think that happiness is a way to help others." And that is it. I have my email address. If you want any additional information about this community, I could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, as you can probably tell. But I'm happy to share more resources with you and talk with you about any of the topics that we've talked about today. So thank you for your time and for your interest in this topic, which is clearly my passion.
So I'm going to join you. So thank you so much. I have a million questions.
Do we want to stop screen sharing?
Yeah. What do you think, Rachel?
Yeah, that's fine. You can stop so you can see.
Let's see. Maybe. You say that, but.
Yeah, but we've seen you
Okay,
the whole time.
I just didn't. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm
good.
Go in here and do that.
Others probably have questions too, but I want another hour of you telling the story of how you conduct your research. And also I want to know more about the peer-led intervention work that you've generated and how that's conducted. And so many questions. Maybe I should first ask if some of our guests here have a question they want to ask. Yeah.
As a retired teacher, do you know of any programs in the school districts where the kids are mainly, any programs they have to educate teachers on the school?
So the question is about programs within the schools to educate the teachers about dealing with their refugee community, their students, the families of their students, etc.
Dallas ISD has actually embedded some really strong refugee caseworkers within the district that do some teacher education throughout the district and visit different schools and that kind of thing. We see very high concentrations, of course, in certain schools, depending on the community. So that's when refugees are resettled, they're typically resettled to a particular area within the community. And by that, then, sorry. and because of that, some schools have very high refugee populations and others don't have hardly any. And so, yes, certainly there are educational programs embedded in those schools.
Yeah, we have one of the online attendees, Bushra, said that RISD, Richardson Independent School District, has launched a similar program.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Love that.
Yeah. You know, you have so many stories to tell, and I'm thinking too about how maybe your efforts in educating the larger community in the DFW area about these families and these needs and the need to be more welcoming.
Yeah.
How do you go about doing that? Or what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so if I can say, one of the things we've seen over time is these enclaves, right? These areas of the city that have become very welcoming. Typically, though, these are areas that see traditionally very large numbers of refugees that come in. Of course, over time, as a refugee family, if you are able to have some success and create some financial stability for your family, you want to move out of that initial place that you were resettled, right? You want access to better schools. You want access to a safer neighborhood. What we see is that when refugee families move, they lose that sense of community and that sense of awareness within their new neighborhood, within their new area about what is a refugee, what is, you know, what is my culture, how do people communicate with me? So I think as we move forward and we have years of refugees that have been now moving out and spreading throughout the Metroplex, that it becomes more and more important to really do more of that education. I think, as you were saying, in terms of looking at how can we educate schools across the board, not just these schools that have these high concentrations, and same thing for neighborhood associations and things like that. Yeah.
I mean, we know that DISD deals with, I don't know, 19, 29, I can't remember the number. 19 is what I remember, different languages of the children in school. And you did mention the difficulties when you are a refugee coming here as a teenager, as a middle schooler. My husband works with reading partners, and he's got a second grader this year he's been working with, and he doesn't know how she's not a refugee, but how she's going to deal with third grade. I mean, I can't imagine.
Yeah, it's tough.
Okay.
I don't have great solutions, but yeah, I mean, it's tough, and I think it just means we need more people who are committed and welcoming to this community and willing to do things like Stuart is doing. You know, reading partners, all of that, all of it is so important in terms of helping them feel welcome, because once they feel like they're safe here, they can start to learn. But until they feel like they belong and they're safe and they're welcomed, then it's hard to really get past any of that. You know, there's a big barrier there.
Okay, somebody else.
Yeah. So many questions, Lindsay. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. your anecdote about like food drives is, you know, provide some comic relief, but it also just kind of highlights this need of like, you know, if we're not providing help in the way that's actually helpful, then like, what good is that? So do you, I mean, for people that hear your presentation and want to do something to give back to these communities, like what do you recommend?
Yeah, I would recommend actually reaching out to one of the resettlement agencies. So IRC is one here in Dallas that is, that's the International Rescue Committee. And they are very prolific in terms of the kinds of supports that they provide to refugee families upon initial resettlement, and then beyond that. Catholic Charities is another one. World Relief is another one. And then finally, what is the Texas, what is it? RST, yeah, Refugee Services of Texas. So any of those 4 agencies would be great starting points. Vickery Meadow is an area that has a huge number, of course, of resettled families, and there are community organizations within Vickery Meadow that have popped up and are really embedded in the communities and know what they need. So that would be another place, another resource, Vickery Meadow Community Association.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any others? I'll ply you with questions afterwards. Yeah.
Hi,
Carmen. Oh, you know Carmen?
I do know Carmen.
Oh, we all know Carmen.
She was one of my students a while ago.
I had the opportunity to do my internship in the clinic. That was very good experience for me, and I was working and helping them with the finances. Remember?
Yes,
that's right.
Send the letters to the institutions, financials to pay the bills, the medical issues, something like that. So when I was there, that put in my mind how we working for the financial issues, learning how the system is working. So now I'm the financial issues, so I'm thinking to be a social worker in finances. So in my question is now that they have something like teaching them how the money works here, because I mean it's different. Also in my culture, people working, and they never saving money. They don't thinking how the money works for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do you have any class to teaching them when they start, when they had the permissions to work, start gaining their own money, when they had the issues to pay the house and everything?
Yeah.
Do you have something in place to help them to visualize, pay quickly the house, pay quickly the car?
Yeah.
I mean, that happens to me. So that's why I learned a lot from my experience. And that's why I say when I was working with Dr. Owen, I went to the houses in Bangman Lake in the area. When I went to there, I can see the big TV and a lot of things. And I said, oh my God, this costs a lot of money. And television, the best one at the time. And the education was a little behind. Yeah. So that's why I decided to focus and help the families take the money, because the money will take a year. If we're here, we need to learn that.
Absolutely.
So that's why we ask you how you kind of help, how you
do you work in this area? And how
the
have you
issue
encouraged?
the families when they have established here.
Yeah, so financial literacy is really important for new refugees coming over here. And so some of the resettlement agencies do offer financial literacy courses. One intervention I did with Catholic Charities and partner with Catholic Charities is looking at a sustainable economic development model for refugee women. These were actually Bhutanese women, and teaching them how to use the skills that they brought over as weavers. So I think you may have seen there was a picture of a woman weaving using a loom, a hand loom. That's common in many of these cultures. And so really tapping into this strength, this thing that these women really enjoyed, and helping them to create a sustainable marketing plan. So combining their skill with something that they could actually sell, and then kind of helping propel that forward in collaboration with other family members around, you know, financial literacy and learning how to make priorities about where to spend your money and how to save your money. And one thing I do want to mention also, so I think that we need to do more of that. And I think that's a really important point. I want to also mention, because I didn't, that this community is particularly vulnerable to being taken advantage of, especially when we think about financial literacy. So one of the things that we do at the clinic, which has nothing to do with healthcare, is doing folks' taxes every spring. So they bring their tax materials in and we do their taxes for free, because often they are paying upwards of $500 and $600 to have their taxes done, because there are these sharks that come into the community and promise them, you know, a quick payout with their refund check, and then they lose often upwards of half of their refund to these kinds of things. So as a community, I think there are things that all of us, regardless of our skills, are able to really contribute and in a meaningful way, whether it's doing someone's taxes or helping them plan, you know, some savings goals and things like that, to reading, education, and literacy.
I think that's almost a positive end.
Yeah,
Thank you
absolutely.
so much
Yeah.
for joining us and coming. And
Thank you all.
Thank you.